Hi everyone, welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I have a book podcast for you today. So unfortunately, August was not the most prolific month in terms of reading. And all of the books I read were either digital or I have already loaned them to a friend. So I don't have any physical copies of books I read to show you today. But I figured since there's not as many books to talk about, I could maybe give you a little bit of an update on how it's going being a school librarian for the first time. So if you're here for that, I'll put that section at the end of the podcast if you care to listen. But let's dive into some books first. So the first book that I read for this month was actually a reread, and like I was doing with the Marissa Meyer books, I decided to reread it as an audiobook while I was working on other things. But I decided to reread Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. If you watched my most recent Renaissance Fair video, you already knew that I was listening to this, but I decided to cosplay as Tress for the Bristol Renaissance Fair a few weeks ago. So while I was working on the project, while I was working on my costume pieces, I decided to re-listen to the book, just in case there were any details I picked up that I could add to the costume. This has to be one of my all-time favorite books now. I am still working on getting into the rest of the Brandon Sanderson universe, but I have really been loving his standalone novels, and this has to be my favorite. Once I did not realize this note was in the back of the physical book, but I listened to it in the audiobook version because it was at the very end, but he says at the end of the book that he took heavy inspiration from the book/movie The Princess Bride, specifically the movie, because he watched it with his wife and kids during the pandemic, and even though it was a childhood favorite of his, or I don't know how old he is, it was a favorite movie of his. When he showed it to his wife and kids, their response was kind of like, well, it was good, but the movie's called The Princess Bride, and Princess Buttercup doesn't actually have that big of a role in the story. So he wrote this book kind of to address that plot issue, and created a world that felt very similar in terms of just kind of the coziness and the wonder of it and the adventure, but with the female character being much more central to the plot of the story. Tress, I think, is a fantastic female main character, and she is one of those rare female characters who takes on really big adventure challenges while still maintaining a very soft and sweet persona, I guess. And that's kind of rare in science fiction and fantasy, and I just really appreciated it in this book. I also really particularly loved the audiobook version because there's another character in the story named Charlie who is Tress's love interest, and I always pictured him as Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon, and the narrator in the audiobook made him sound like Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon with the very nasally voice, and it just really set into the story that these characters are teenagers and doing all these big adventure things. But I thought that the voices really added a lot to the story, and I don't know if the audiobook narrator did that on purpose, but it was something that I found a lot of joy in, and oh, this character sounds exactly like how I pictured them. Whereas Tress to me felt a lot like, and this is mostly to do with her hair, she's called Tress for a reason, but she very much gives Rapunzel vibes. If Rapunzel boarded a pirate ship and went off on an adventure to rescue her not significant other, but the boy that she loves. And it's just a delightful book and such creative world building. And I know that's what Brandon Sanderson is known for. And one of the things that was so cool about this book is that the oceans on Tress's planet are not made of water. They're made of spores. And that was such a strange element when I first read the book over a year ago at this point, of I never would have thought to create a new world that didn't have oceans made of water. It was such an interesting idea. So that's why she's Tress of the Emerald Sea. The island that she's from is in a sea of green spores where when they come in contact with water, they start to sprout leaves and vines and become very plant-like. But I highly recommend this book, and definitely recommend the audiobook version if you can get your hands on it. I listened to it through Audible, but it's just absolutely wonderful, and really last year reignited my interest in reading fantasy, because reading fantasy as an adult is something that I have kind of struggled with. I'll talk about a book, I think it's behind me. Yeah, a book I read a month or so ago, maybe 2 months ago, called Trial of the Sun Queen, where I specifically talked about how I loved the world building and I liked that it didn't have too many spicy scenes in it. Well, I tried the second book in the series and was immediately put off by the number of intimate scenes that didn't feel necessary to the plot, and in some cases were non-consensual, and that is not something that I want to read, especially with that amount of detail. So I was really disappointed in the second book in that series, but I loved Tress's story because that is so not the vibe. So if you're looking for something similar, that's a great book. And I've been told that, and please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe all of Brandon Sanderson's books are clear of that sort of scene. So if you're looking for adult fantasy that isn't the romantasy side, and obviously like this is a romance fantasy book because Tress is trying to save Charlie, who she loves, but the romantasy category seems to imply explicit scenes, so it is not in that category whatsoever. However, I kind of regret my praises for Trial of the Sun Queen because I was very disappointed by the second book in that series. Anyway, moving on. Now that I've talked about Tress for the second time in a video this year, the next book that I read was Counterfeit, and it's taking a minute to load on my phone. I get really funky internet reception in the basement, despite the fact that we have like an extra signal extender down here. But I read Counterfeit by Kristen Chen, and I read this as an audiobook again. This was a very unique story that I picked up, I think just because it was available. I can't remember if I had put it on hold through Libby or if someone had recommended it. I don't remember why I clicked it initially, but it's about a woman who has a husband and a young child, and she's kind of just feeling lost overall, in her relationship, in being a mother, in being just within her family life. She is really struggling with finding her place. So when someone from her past kind of pops up and gives her a business opportunity, she dives into it almost without thinking, and then all of this crazy trouble ensues. But basically the business opportunity that she becomes involved with is swapping high-end designer bags for high-end fakes and then selling the real ones online, which is something that happens. That's a very real thing, but it very much gave the high-interest intrigue of a thriller murder mystery type of book without any actual murder going on, I don't think. Now I can't remember. I'm looking at the description. There might have been a murder. I don't remember now. Oh, no, there's no murder. Just some kind of mystery elements and some like mafia type connections going on. But it was really interesting to read and really interesting to see the dynamic between a female character balancing this situation she's gotten herself in with a very illegal career that she doesn't want to let go of because it makes her feel fulfilled and like she's doing something and contributing. But also knowing that she can't sustain it forever and isn't sure how it fits into her life as a wife and mother as well. But I really liked the storytelling in this, and I really liked the way that the flaws of the characters were presented, because you still feel very sympathetic to the characters. You as the reader are very understanding of where they're coming from, despite the fact that this is something clearly not legal to engage in. So highly recommend that book if you're interested in kind of the thriller mystery category of things. It was a good, like, low stakes thriller. Obviously, like, the amount of jail time that would go with something like that is decently high. But low stakes in terms of, like, there's no gore, there's no like threat of physical danger, we'll say it that way. But very, very interesting story. The next book that I read was a really quick read, and this is the only physical book that I read this month, but I let a friend borrow my copy already. But I read the Anne of Green Gables graphic novel version. This was absolutely delightful. If you're not familiar with the story of Anne of Green Gables, I highly recommend this as kind of an entry-level way to read it if you're not sure you want to commit to the series yet. But it is obviously a very well-loved story over the years. There's several movie and television adaptations. But what I liked about the graphic novel was that it gave kind of a sneak peek of subsequent books at the end. It didn't end where the first Anne of Green Gables book ends. It gives you kind of a snapshot of some later moments in her life that are in later books in the series, and I really liked that. I also loved how soft and peaceful all of the illustrations were. I loved the visual of seeing Anne's thoughts instead of it being like written out in typical prose. The fact that it was like actual speech bubbles in her head, or like seeing things through her eyes. I thought the graphic novel format fit this story really well for a character who's so imaginative and so like kind of in her own world. It was a really interesting way to view that story. Obviously, I still recommend the prose version of the book as well. The graphic novel definitely did not cover every single plot point from the original book, but if you have maybe a younger reader, or this has been on your bucket list for a while and you've just never approached it, this is a good way to get yourself started. The last one I read, I was kind of conflicted about this one. So because I read a lot of thrillers and mysteries, I've had people recommend Freida McFadden to me for a while. So when one of them came up as immediately available as an audiobook on Libby, I decided to go for it. And the one that I read was Do Not Disturb. And this book takes place after a woman has, and I'm going to forget the character's name. Her name is Quinn. So Quinn is our main character, and her story starts with her murdering her husband, which is usually not what happens at the beginning of a thriller book. She murders her husband in self-defense and then panics and knows or feels that she wouldn't be able to plead self-defense, and decides it's better to just disappear. So she leaves her house, the scene of the crime, and drives until she ends up hitting a snowstorm and a small motel where she has to kind of camp out for the night. And while she's at that hotel, she starts to notice some strange things about the owner and his wife and the long-term guest that's staying in the motel. I did really like kind of the ambiance of this. I have discovered I really like vacation thrillers, or thrillers that take place in like hotels or like places where the character is not familiar with the setting. And this definitely kind of fit that vibe, and part of why I went for it. Obviously the Do Not Disturb cover looked like a Do Not Disturb door sign that you would find on a hotel door. However, I was slightly disappointed with the wrap up of the story. I won't go into too many details. I think it's still definitely worth the read if you read thrillers really quickly or just looking for something to like listen to as an audiobook while you do other tasks. It was still entertaining. I do think it pulled a little bit of an easy resolution to the story. I tend to like thrillers where the character who ended up doing it is truly a surprise, in that you wouldn't have suspected them earlier because they're close to the main character. They're like had a solid alibi. And this didn't do that. It kind of pulled a solution seemingly out of nowhere to the story, and I'm not crazy about when that happens. It still worked. I wouldn't say it was like an implausible storyline. It just kind of felt like one of those where you as the reader had no way of solving it on your own because you weren't given enough information. So if that doesn't bother you, this book is great. If it does bother you, this might not be the best fit for you. I would love to know if anyone has read other Frida McFadden books, if they are all like that, of kind of the whirlwind, like pulled out of nowhere ending, or if they have kind of more inventive solutions. I would love to know. This one also definitely took a lot of inspiration from like Hitchcock movies. It gives a little bit of like Rear Window vibes. So the atmosphere was a 10 out of 10. I think the plot was like a 6 out of 10. We'll put it that way. But those are all the books that I read this month. So you'll notice I had a lot of audiobooks. 3 whole audiobooks in 1 month, which is a lot for me. I think usually at most I can get 2 audiobooks in 1 month. But I was doing a lot of work in the school library this month with finalizing setup and all of that stuff. So one of the things I was doing is labeling every single book in the library. And when I say labeling, I don't mean like the call number labels that you'll find in a library where it has the author's last name and what section it goes in. I decided to color code the library because I'm working with kids. That seemed easier than putting a label, like a typed label, on there. So some libraries will put a spine label that will say like adult fiction or young adult fiction, or like name the section. I decided to do it by color. So what I did was put colored masking tape at the top of every shelf so that kids could visually see what color the shelf was supposed to be. And then I just put a dot on the already existing spine label to match the book to the section. So we ended up with all of our picture books have red dots. All of our fiction picture books have red dots. Non-fiction picture books have pink dots. Early reader books, which are all together fiction and nonfiction, have orange dots. Beginner chapter book fiction has yellow dots. Middle grade fiction has blue dots. Young adult fiction has purple dots. Early graphic novels have white dots. Middle grade graphic novels have black dots, and middle grade and up nonfiction has green dots. So I put, with some help, my mom came and helped me a couple times, put a dot on every single book in the library. And as I last checked on our computer, our library has about 17,000 books in it, which seems like a crazy number. However, because I did weeding over the summer, like pulling out books from the collection that we no longer need, I know what 1,000 books look like because that's how much I had to remove from the collection that had gotten like really nasty. But it still like doesn't quite process in my head that there are 17,000 books in our library. But that is how many there are, and they now all have dots on them. I had to do sticker dots for some books because they clearly had some previous organization system that was also color-coded. So for any of the book levels that already had dots on them, we had to use sticker dots to cover the previous dot label. But for a majority of the books, we could do just a dot with Sharpie, which is a lot easier in the long run. And any new books that come into the library will also just get a Sharpie dot on them. But that's what I was up to, and that's why I could listen to so many audiobooks, because putting dots on books doesn't require a ton of brain power. So I would just pop on an audiobook and go through the shelves, putting dots on the spines. It did get really funny at one point because I was kind of struggling with the ones on the bottom shelf just because it's a weird angle to be at if you're like crawling around. So I finally got the bright idea to go up to the school gym and borrow a gym class scooter. So then I was scooting around on the floor doing all the labels. I was really glad nobody was in the building when I did that. But it was very fun and made it a lot easier and less neck and back pain because of it. So it worked. It just probably looked very funny if anybody had happened to walk by while I was doing that. But I'm really enjoying being a librarian. I love reading stories with the kids. We've only had a couple full days of school so far at the time of filming this, but I have really, really been enjoying it. And I look forward to all of the fun book-related things I have planned for the kids. And I look forward to maybe having some time to read my own books coming up here pretty soon. Maybe one can dream. But that's going to be it for this podcast. It was a little bit of a shorter one today, and I hope that's okay with you, and thank you for watching either way. If you liked what you saw today, make sure that you hit the subscribe button down below. I post a lot of reading and craft-related content on my channel, so please check it out. I would really appreciate it if you do. And if you want to follow me on other social media sites, that information is in the description box below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.